So we're going to go over Spanish Renaissance today, and my drink for Spanish Renaissance, sangria. So, start looking at your board notes, looking at 711 of the 15th century, the Moors occupy Spain. Now, one of the things what we're looking at here for the Renaissance with Spanish theater is what's known as the Siglo de Oro, or the Golden Age. Right? And this is the golden age of Spanish drama. But it doesn't begin in 711. It's actually like roughly 1580 to 1680. But we have to go back and sort of see what shapes it to begin with. So from 711 to 15th century, the Moors occupy Spain. So you have the Moors and the Catholics occupying Spain around the same time. What that is going to end up doing is it's going to shape Spanish dramatic literature differently than the English and the French and even the Germans and the Italians. Because you have that sort of Moorish cultural concept and their attitude toward women and honor sort of clashing then in with the religious faith and doctrine of Catholicism, right? So that's why they're, not only the culture in general, so based on honor and how they, and a different way to treat the women, why a lot of their literature is vastly different. It's all about knights with honor and so on and so forth, right? So that's going to be a major thrust in how we see plays develop throughout the Spanish Renaissance. By 1200, the Christian kingdoms of northern Spain had begun attacking the Moors. And the Christian kingdoms sort of unite, actually, in this sort of part of what forms Spain as a nation in and of itself. It was like everything else, like Germany and France and others, a factious group of areas. And the Christians all get together and unite in order to attack and try to expel the Moors from the country. And that's what sort of unites Spain as, well, it wasn't, it didn't unite completely as one country, but it was sort of two. But, so that took about 76 years, roughly, for them to actually begin to get the Moors completely out of Spain. Now, they were out of all but roughly the southeastern peninsula by 1276. So that's what we're looking at there is the Moors may have been driven out, or were still in the process of being completely driven out of Spain, but their culture had a lasting impact on the Spanish people in general, as well as the literature that comes later. So looking again at your board notes here, 1473, we see printing is introduced into Spain. With it, you start seeing Greek and Latin works come back in, and an interest in classical study, which is typically in every country just sort of the birth of the Renaissance. All right. In 1479, Aragon and Castile unite under Ferdinand and Isabella. Now we're looking at it becoming practically one major country. All right. And this was the beginning of the Christianization of Spain. Now, since they united as a major power now and under the Christian rule of the Catholic Church, by the way, Spain, one of the few countries over in Europe that remained Catholic long after the rest of Europe had sort of predominantly become Protestant. So by 1480, they institute what was known as the Inquisition. Have you ever heard of that before, the Spanish Inquisition? Well, that's what happens in 1480, and it is to hunt down and punish the heretics. Of course, mainly the Moors. All Jews, all Moors expelled from Spain. But then there were other heretics, like actors, right, who were excommunicated from the church, yes, even here. And they had to, the actors were, well, all of them were given the chance, but predominantly the actors were given a chance to recant their beliefs or face death. So it was impacting the theatrical development insofar as either executing or fundamentally changing the actors, because you couldn't consider yourself a Catholic and remain an actor. So your choice was an actor or death, right? So that's what we're looking at by around 1480. Roughly, by the mid-1500s, Catholicism was declining pretty much everywhere, but it still had a major foothold in Spain. So next we see 1492, Moors are completely driven out of Spain. And the famous Columbus's voyage over to America begins to give Spain this sort of a dominant foothold in the New World, and it gets it more power in the Old World, along with more gold and other riches that is being brought back over from the New World. So now we're seeing Spain kind of rise out of nowhere and become one of the major powers of Europe. And of course, like we've talked about many times again, that then brings with it the expectation of, well, if you're a powerful nation, you should be cultured as well. So that's going to be an impetus to give them their own national drama and their style of theater. So we look at the board notes here, and you see 1508 to 1540, secular drama emerges. Now, secular drama, again, secular meaning non-religious, it begins to become popular early 1500s. Again, mostly plays by Plautus and Terence. These are being done in universities. They're actually even mandated at Salamanca University by 1538. So we see these dramas being pushed forth, these classical type works. And by 1513, though, even, we have one of our first writers who we'll talk about when we get down to playwrights, Juan de la Encina, who is considered the father of Spanish drama. So it's on its way by 1508. By 1513, you have a modern writer. Now, granted, when Juan de la Encina started, he started writing religious plays. So we're still in that movement between religious and secular dramas. But regardless, it was sort of Spain's voice as a playwright. So that's sort of the birth, that section, that area there is the birth and emergence of Spanish drama. 1548, you start seeing plays by native writers and Italian plays being performed in court. And also at that time, you start seeing, in addition to that, you have simultaneously going on these plays known as autos sacramentales, which you see a couple more sections down in your notes. The autos sacramentales are a mixture of cycle plays and morality plays. We'll talk about those in just a second. By 1550, you see Spain basically being unquestionably the most powerful nation in the world due to all of its holdings and acquirings that it got in the New World. So now that it has power, it has to really beef up the cultural end of what it has. And so the problem you see is that the Catholic Church still has such a stranglehold on it. So it's kind of slow to have the secular drama emerge, and it clings to its more medieval style, which are the autos sacramentales. You see in the next thing there, the autos sacramentales ran roughly from 1550 to 1765, long after all religious plays pretty much everywhere else had been banned. They continued on, and in the same manner practically, in Spain, because of that stranglehold that the Catholic Church had upon Spain. All right, so let's look at the autos sacramentales for a minute. Originally, they were associated with the Corpus Christi, which is a festival that emphasizes the power of the Church's sacraments, and they were produced pretty much simultaneously. The Corpus Christi festival was using the autos sacramentales to tell its stories, and these are performed by professional troops. So they combine sort of characteristics of morality plays along with cycle plays. They've got human and supernatural characters that are mingling along with allegorical characters. And the stories could be drawn from absolutely any source, even secular sources, as long as they illustrated the efficacy of the sacraments and the church dogma. So the city council assumes control somewhere between 1551 to 1558 of these plays. So shortly after they really began, the city council sort of jumps in and says, we're gonna take a handle on this, and they start having professional actors taking the roles in these cycle plays. And much like in England, well, actually in medieval Europe, you have trade guilds that are taking over funding and coordinating each of the plays. So at that point in time, we start seeing something very similar to what we're used to from the medieval era. The professional actors brought into play, trade guilds paying for it, and initially 3 autos were given each year, and that changes in 1592 where they bump it up to 4 autos, and then later they bump it back down to 2. The production style is roughly by the end of the 16th century, so late 1500s, is going to basically be the same way that they'll keep it until about 1705. There's some changes that happen around that time, and we'll talk about it. The interesting thing that we have with these things is they were around 1600. The first performance was usually given to the king, in front of the king at the courtyard, and then they would move the plays into the town square, and they kind of do the same sort of processional type thing that we remember from the medieval theater. But after 1705, the processional style of that stopped, and they started doing them in actual theaters. Now these could last for days now because they'd be moving these stories around from place to place. And they changed the number of performers or companies that were allowed to do so. At first, when they first started in 1550s, only one company was allowed to do it. Well, shortly after that, a second company, I think it was after 1592, a second company was allowed to do it as well. So you have 2 professional troupes, and there's a whole bunch of stories were playing here at the same time, and the placement around the Madrid in different theaters and so on and so forth allowed this festival to go on for days. Now the carts that remember the pageant wagons that we had in the medieval era, well these had similar ones here known as carros, C-A-R-R-O-S. Those were their carts. These were usually about 16 feet long and about up to 36 feet high, which meant that they were like 2 stories high. And again, the number of carts changed as far as well. So there were 2 carts, and then there were 4 carts later on. And they wouldn't even like, okay, here's our story on 4 carts, and we'll move our 4 carts, and the next story comes in and there's 4 more carts. They actually put all 8 carts together, and the stories were done one right after the other, giving it a distance, really, sort of a size of about 40 to 50 feet long now and 36 feet deep for these carts all stacked together to make these stories. So now you're looking at basically the same thing we had in England a century before, of the same stage area, the staging area in the tiring house. So that's how they originally sort of ran these performances. By 1765, they actually, the autos sacramentales were actually forbidden. And the reason is because it sort of created a carnival atmosphere. So I'm thinking what kind of happened was these became very popular. They were going around the town square. It became a festival atmosphere. People kind of got excited about it. Then people got a little too excited about it. And then finally people went, you know what, this is going crazy. You know, excuse me. How many deaths or something we have so involved in this huge carnival atmosphere, children getting run over by carts, who knows. But nonetheless, it was just carnival atmosphere that they could not really tolerate anymore. So they forbade the performances, even inside theaters, again, because you have people milling from one place to another to go catch the next show. They forbade the autos sacramentales, and they were no longer seen after 1765. Couple that also with the church kind of going, yeah, it's really still not really good that our Christ figures and historical holy characters are being played by actors with questionable morals. So that came back up again. So that's that whole chunk there on Autos Sacramentales. You'll see after that, you've got something in here that says between 1551 to 1558, the city council assumes some control of the Autos Sacramentales. Well, we already discussed that. All right. And then under that, it's until the 1580s, performances were only allowed on Sundays and feast days. Any kind of performance whatsoever, secular or Autos Sacramentales, performed on Sundays and feast days. Well, that was okay for them until all of a sudden a Commedia dell'arte troupe shows up, 1579, and they're allowed to play on a weekday. And so shortly after that, the Spaniards said, they could play on a weekday. Why can't we? So after the 1580s, that release is given to play not just on Sundays and feast days, but any day during the week. And I jumped a little bit there. Sorry about that. But if you look back there, in 1570, you see theater blossoms, and major cities boast acting troops, and you start to see some permanent theaters. It was around that time, and it was because of the fervor from the Autos Sacramentales that was so popular. And all of a sudden you have writers that are writing secular dramas. All of a sudden you start seeing professional acting troops begin. We have professional acting troops already for the Autos Sacramentales. What do they do during the rest of the year when there's not festivals going on? Well, they start banding together and forming troops, and by 1570s you have actual professional acting troops in Madrid, and they start building some permanent theaters. Now, most of the theaters that they built were temporary stages, and we're usually sort of in an alleyway, so they could basically, if you think about it, you put a stage at the end of an alleyway, you've got walls on either side, which are the buildings, and then just a front area there, which you have to sort of secure so that people can just storm in without paying, and you have a basic little theater space, unroofed, much like it was in the Elizabethan era, and it's functional. So no tennis court thing here. Here we're doing it sort of like between buildings. But then they start building a few permanent theater structures. We'll talk about those a little bit when we get into the theater architecture section here. All right. So 1580 to 1680 is what is known as the Siglo de Oro, the golden age of Spanish dramatic literature. And that is based on the concept of this is where you start seeing professional troops, professional writers, theaters being built, and it really begins to blossom. In 1588, the Spanish Armada is defeated by the English. Now, what the hell does that have to do with theater? Well, by the way, really interesting story about that. The English had a crappy navy. They didn't have a navy. They're on an island. What do they care? They're away from everybody else. They didn't have a navy. Well, all of a sudden, Spain built this incredible armada that could take over the world. It's the best navy in the world. And they found out that they were coming for them. So Elizabeth did something brilliant. She didn't have the money or the time, really, to commission a whole bunch of naval warships to be built. So she decided to say, all right, from now on, royal decree, everyone shall eat fish on Fridays. Well, where are you going to get the fish? Fishermen. They're going to build their ships, go out there, fish, bring it in, because now everyone in the country has to eat it on Friday. So now it's lucrative. They build ships, decent ships, really quickly, and it's a merchant fleet effectively, and they fish, and they bring it all back in, and they make money. When the Spanish Armada was coming, Queen Elizabeth turned to all these merchants and said, I'm taking your ships. And they outfitted them with English cannon, which was much more accurate than Spanish cannon. So Spaniards came up around Europe there, lost a number of their fleet in a storm on the way in, hit the English Channel, and again, Elizabeth was very smart. She ordered that they were not to attack the Spanish, certainly not board them. The smart thing to do was to sit fire, because they had a longer reach with their cannons, shoot at them when they're coming in there, back up, keep shooting, back up, keep shooting. And that's how she defeated the Spanish Armada, the best armada in the world at the time. So, what did that have to do with theater? Nothing really, that was just a really cool story. But, in reality, what happened was, it was a big blow to Spain as a world power. Their armada had been defeated. It allowed the rest of the world, the French, the Dutch, and the English, to go over to the New World and start staking out claims. A place that until then predominantly only the French had been mining for all of its resources. So there's that. So let's look at the next thing is the end of the 16th century popular dramatic types. You have the commedia, which is any full-length play. It's not just a comedy or tragedy, any full-length play. Two basic types of comedias. The capa y espada play, which is translates to cape and sword play, usually revolves around a gentleman of minor rank, which is why it's capa y espada. He would be wearing a cape and a sword in public. That's part of his dress to denote that he is wealthy and is a person of some rank. And then you have a teatro, rido, o cuerpo, three different names for basically the same type of play. All right, and that's a play in which rulers, nobles, mythical characters, or saints are involved in actions set in remote places or these kind of remote time periods. So those are that's the main type theater. Now you have other sort of smaller type things. You have entremeses, which are basically the same thing as our Italian intermezzi, English masks, and French ballet de cour. All right, they are short topical sketches performed in intervals between acts, usually at plays in court. They later actually evolved into these short sort of farces called sainetes. I don't think you really need to know that. Sainete, if you want to know that. And the last one we have is a loa. And until 1615, every performance began with this. So this is sort of like a prologue kind of thing. And it might not exactly have anything to do with the show that it's a prologue to, but it's a short little piece. Or even a short sketch for that matter. And another type was actually created by Calderón, a writer we'll talk about in a little bit, and this was called the zarzuela. It was a short, light piece, usually based on some sort of classical myth or something like that. Quite often had music infused with it, and usually it was written on. Calderón wrote tons of these. They were written usually on demand for court, but then became increasingly popular with public theater. All right. That says down there, by 1660, Spain is already beginning to lose its power in the New World. Or in the Old World, excuse me. Okay, that's true. I don't know what else it has to do with anything in there, but it's already beginning to lose power. Now let's look at playwrights. First playwright we have is Juan del Encina. We talked about him already a little bit, the father of Spanish drama. Like I said, his first plays were religious, but then he moved into secular plays because he lived in Italy for a time. And he started writing these secular dramas, and they were the first ones to be performed, first secular dramas to be performed. Then we have Juan de la Cuerva. He's one of the first dramatists to actually draw his subject matter from Spanish history. So that's going to be a real big thing for us because later writers will follow that. So all of your plays are going to be drawn on Spanish history or Spanish culture or things along that line. So he sort of gave it that nationalistic flavor to it. Then we have Miguel de Cervantes, and he is remembered pretty much for his novel Don Quixote, if you've ever heard of that before. But he wrote about 30 plays, like 16 or so actually have survived, and they're mostly about history of Spain and contemporary Spanish life. Next person we have is Lope Felix de Vega Carpio, usually known by us as Lope de Vega. He was the most prolific writer. I think he wrote like some 800 plays, and there's only about 450 that survived. Only 450 that have survived. And he wrote comedias, full lengths, majority of those being capa y espadas, the cape and sword plays. And then we have Pedro Calderón de la Barca. And he wrote primarily for the court. Actually, in 1651, he had become a priest, and he continued to write autos sacramentales. As a matter of fact, a lot of the autos sacramentales were written by him for the city of Madrid, and then he also wrote occasional plays for court. He wrote somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 plays. I think about 100 of them are still in existence. 80 of those are obras sacramentales. Okay. Spanish theater architecture. All right. The big thing to know about Spanish theater architecture is corrales. That is the name for the theater building. Very similar to carros, but it's not. It's corrales. And it's, again, very similar to an outdoor rectangular Elizabethan theater. The interesting thing about these were that even the temporary ones, they were controlled by three sort of non-profit organizations in the area, like hospitals, things like that, right? Grant accepting organizations, and they were basically used as fundraisers. And the hospitals being one of those ones, in 1615, the city of Madrid was ordered by the crown to start paying a subsidy to the hospitals. Well, all of a sudden, that meant that the theaters they were getting money from, but they're also getting money from the city of Madrid, so the city of Madrid wasn't cool with that anymore, so they started leasing out the theaters. Okay? Normally they release to entrepreneurs for like 4-year periods and such, but then that a good payment would come back to the city of Madrid for that, which would then, of course, subsidize the hospital. So it's still kind of now in a roundabout way. The money is still kind of helping nonprofit organizations. But the interesting thing about this is that at no point in theater history of Spain that we know of, at least in the Renaissance, did the actors ever control the theaters like they did in England and in France. Right? Just wasn't done. We do know that during the Golden Age there were some theaters that were built that were permanent, but for the most part a lot of them were temporary. A couple of theaters that were permanent theaters, the Corral de la Cruz. That was the first permanent theater in Spain, and it opened in Madrid. And the Corral de Príncipe. This actually was interesting, because remember I was talking about an alleyway. This one actually was built that way. This was built between two actual, like, tenement buildings, two housing buildings. All right, so at the end of the alley, you had the stage. At this other end here, they constructed a wall that used to be the opening of the alley. And the side walls of the tenement buildings ended up being the sides of the theater, but they left the second floor windows of these people's houses and the third floor windows of these people's houses open to viewing. So these people would rent out their houses so people could actually like sit in their house next in their window, staring out in there to see the show. They charge them for it. The third story windows were called aposentos. The fourth story were called desvanes because they meant that meant like attic, right? So you kind of cramped space up there for the fourth story one. The second ones were barred up, so nobody could like climb out, climb into the theater or whatever. So they could sneak in. So that's the sort of the viewing of the sort of galleries where we see in the in Elizabethan and French. Those are the galleries there. They're actually people's homes that have windows. Down to the first and second floor, they have seating units called grades. There's sort of stepped seating units coming up to the roughly second floor area on the sides of the theater there. They had some benches a little later on, not right away, but a little later on. They had benches in the area that people could sit on in the groundling area. All right, that back wall that was built that would empty out into the street normally is now the front wall of the theater itself. That back area on the ground floor there, that was called an alojera. That was like a refreshment stand, a place where you could buy beer and tamales and so on and so forth. The story above that was called the cazuela, and that's where only women were allowed. No men were allowed to sit in the cazuela, but no women were allowed also in the patio, which is the groundling area. They separated the men and the women in this area, so it was a little less dodgy than I talked about what it was in Elizabethan and in the French area, right? So that's the basic sort of construct. By the 18th century, they actually started putting a roof over the whole construct there with some skylights in there so you can get some light. But the staging area was pretty much the same, the sort of tiring house, what we call it for the Elizabethan era, the stage and the house behind it, same basic construct as it was in Elizabethan England, including the inner below, inner above, 2 doors on either side of that, same kind of setup as it was in the Elizabethan era they had in this one. Now, by 1638, the control of the Corrales passed, of course, to the city of Madrid, and they ran that. By the 18th century, all the Corrales were torn down. Looking at actors and costuming, by 1454, actors are paid to perform at the Corpus Christi. So all of the actors in the Autos Sacramentales who were doing shows for Corpus Christi, all paid actors. 1539, you have 6 actors that are paid to perform farces at the cathedral in Toledo. By 1529, 1535, 1538, and 1579, you have Italian companies appearing in Spain. And this is important because it's going to give it a bit of an influence. Most of the Italian companies that appear are going to be commedia dell'arte type troupes. So it's going to have a little bit of an influence on their style of theater when these troupes start appearing and playing there. By 1550, we have a much larger number of professional acting troupes existing, and they were 2 types. They either had salaried actors, they just paid them all a set wage, or they had share companies, just like England, just like France. The share companies were called Compagnies di la Parte. Not di la Parte, Compagnies di la Parte. Di la comes from the next one, which is Compagnies de la Ligue, which is touring companies, companies of the league, or touring. Okay. So those are the 2 main kind of companies that you did have. And the average company had about 16 to 20 people in it, men and women, because by 1687 we start seeing women licensed to be on stage. Before that, like everywhere else, women roles are played by men. Now, you see a bunch of changes here in the dates as far as, like, well, women are not allowed to be on stage. Well, yes, they are, right? It kind of fluctuates back and forth. But predominantly the basic structure of the Renaissance era was 16 to 20 men and women in a company. And I really don't have the reasoning for this, but 1587 we see women on stage. 1596 the church bans women on stage. Now I understand the reasoning because of the church's mindset. It's disreputable. But 2 years later, the ban's lifted. But it's only lifted if their husbands or fathers are in the company. Perhaps they feel that if they can keep, if a man can keep an eye on them, then it's okay for them to be disreputable. Okay. Anyway, that was what was going on. But they also had pretty harsh censorship on the dresses that they wore and dances they did and so on and so forth when they let them back on stage. By 1603, the crown reduces the number of legal companies to be allowed in Madrid to 8. And then 1615, it jumps the number back up to 12. Plays can only be performed if they're licensed, and this was usually granted by city officials, and you had to give them a free performance in order for them to grant that to you. Spain actually also did have an Actors Guild. That was the Cofradía de la Novena. That was the Actors Guild. Still in existence today, actually. Actors are frequently called upon by the court to come in and play, and they actually, many of them led very well-to-do lives. So acting wasn't as horrendous in Spain, oddly enough, considering the stranglehold of the Catholic Church. It didn't seem to be as bad financially as living in Spain as it was in the places that had become Protestant. Go figure. Costuming is pretty much going to be the same thing we were looking at in Elizabethan era, French era, pretty much your average contemporary clothing, unless you have legendary or heroic characters or evil characters or Moors or something along that line. Then they have nasty costumes for it. And costumes are considered an actor's greatest asset because they can pawn them in lean times They can get work because they have a large repertoire of costuming. So they kept them as long as they possibly could. Scenic practices at the time are very similar to the English theaters. You have, like I said, you've got your inner below. We talked about that in the architecture. Your inner above. The stage floors had trapdoors on them, machinery for flying people. So it was really very similar to what we see in the same era in England and in France. Most stage sizes were roughly 26 to 30 feet deep and 25 to 30 feet wide. So they did start using painted flats after roughly 1650. So you don't really ever see the Italianate scenery explode there until later than that even. But it still has some of that medieval concept of their scenery. It won't be until we start importing some Italian designers a little bit later that you'll see that kind of kick forward. So, and mostly in the courts, because looking at the next thing, we have court entertainments. Philip III reigned from 1598 to 1621, and he had court performances regularly. Why? Because his wife loved theater, so he had theater brought there on a regular basis for her. So professional productions in court masques, well, not the court masques, but the entremeses, were given frequently until her death in 1611. After that, it kind of stopped. Philip IV, however, then did the same thing with his wife. Raised court theater to its height during his reign because he and his wife actually liked theater. He saw like about 300 plays in a 30-year period. Between 1623 and 1653, he saw roughly 300 plays, so it's like 10 a year. And Italianate scenery had been used occasionally, but it became really common when Philip IV brought in Cosmilotti, an Italian designer. And he was imported from Florence in 1626. And the plays were given in halls or gardens until about 1633, when they had a new palace built in Madrid, the Buen Retiro. And that became the new center for court entertainments. In the Buen Retiro, in 1640, Cosmilotti built one of the most lavish theaters there, and it was called the Coliseo. And it was said to have been built to resemble the Corrales because they have that pride in their national heritage. And the difference was the courtyard area was roofed. It was all enclosed. The cool thing about this was that Philip allowed the public to come into his palace theater. Now, he charged them for it, but he then gave away a percentage of what came in there to the local charities, again, like the hospital and stuff like that. So, kind of very cool indeed. So, looking at the decline of Spanish theater, first of all, we have plenty of rebellions going on right now. So, every time you have rebellions, civil war, things like that, theater tends to become less of an importance to the government because they're busy stamping out fires. So the Catalans and the Portuguese are rebelling, and so he has to deal with that. 1643, Cosmilotti dies, and then in 1644, the Queen died, and that virtually stopped court performances. But Philip remarried in 1650, and 1651 court performances started again. So that means from 1645 to 1651, roughly, court theater pretty much stopped. Theater in general, overall, the public theaters were even closed. That's really close to the same years that England's theaters were closed. Roughly 1644 to 1660 in England. So really close to those, and it's just happenstance. Another Italian designer in 1652, Baccio da Bianco. He's not on your list here. This is more information you don't ever need to know in your life, but here it is for you. He was brought in, and the use of spectacular scenery started to finally explode in Spain by him. And court performances kind of fell off when Philip died in 1665, but they were resumed in 1670. And this is when Carlos II is now on the throne. And the cool thing about that is that because Bianco came in and started doing designing and then court performances fell out for a while, Once they resume in 1670, we see the emergence of a Spanish designer, which kind of like never existed before. And this man's name is Jose Caudi, and Caudi. So he starts coming in and helping to design these plays. But then, unfortunately, 11 years later, in 1681, Calderón dies, their greatest, their most prolific writer. A number of other writers try to copy him, it doesn't really work, and that kind of falls off. So by 1700, which is the death of Carlos II, and Calderón is dead, none of the other writers can compare to him, and court theater has fallen off, you sort of see the decline and end of theater in general. Now we're actually a little bit 20 years past our siglo de oro of Spanish theater, but by 1700 it's pretty well dead, and their most productive period is finally at an end. And that ends Spanish theater, and we'll be moving on into the Restoration in our next section.